Premiership Rugby is the top tier of English rugby union, and it's one of the world's premier club rugby competitions. It features an interesting array of stadiums, some of which might be familiar even if you don't follow rugby. So with that being said, here are the Premiership Rugby 2021-22 stadiums. The Recreation Ground, home of Bath Rugby. Situated in a beautiful location by the River Avon is this rather unique stadium, given that the large eastern stand is actually temporary. They love their cricket in Somerset, so every summer they set aside the temporary seating in order to play some cricket. Because if it was left like this, well, even Jimmy Anderson would be hitting sixes for fun. It's quite rare to see so much uncovered seating in England, but I don't think Bath is that bad when it comes to weather. There are plans to redevelop the facility, but they are facing obstacles, due to the fact that they don't and can't own the land on which the stadium's located, if I'm not mistaken. But it seems alright as it is. Ashton Gate, home of Bristol Bears. It has also been the long-time home of Bristol City. They set up shop here 110 years before the Bears came along. But who wouldn't want to play at Ashton Gate, especially when this was their previous home? I'm not going to say it's terrible, but it has certainly seen better days. Ashton Gate is dubbed by many as the Anfield of the South, and when I say many, I just mean myself really, and probably some other guy. But it is similar in some ways. Red seats, one particularly large stand. Okay, that's about it. But it's a fine stadium in its own right. And what Anfield doesn't have is a view of the rather spectacular Clifton Suspension Bridge, which I believe a few seats in the main stand would have a fairly decent view of, but correct me if I'm wrong. Sandy Park, home of the Exeter Chiefs. It's named for the sandy soil in which it was built. Actually, I can't confirm that, but it looks pretty sandy to me, so it would make sense. Oh, and while we're out here, the facade of the main stand there makes quite the impression from the road. It looks nice. It's a fairly interesting stadium, this one. It goes from a pretty modern and large stand on one side, the one we just saw, to a small rudimentary stand on the other. And due to the elevated position of the stadium as well as the disparity in size between the two stands, it allows for some expansive views of the farmland and whatnot. Kingsholm Stadium, home of Gloucester Rugby. Just like the last one, it too has a pretty good looking large modern stand on one side of the ground, and a small terrace on the other, which offers some expansive views once again. There's nothing that's special out that way, but I quite like when you can see outside the stadium. Speaking of that terrace on the other side, the shed, as it's known, is rather unique in that it curves inwards in one corner, which means that the fans are very close to the action in that area. Other than that, the rest of the ground is your standard rugby stadium. Twickenham Stoop, home of Harlequins. It's not just a coincidence that there's another stadium with Twickenham in the name. It's a stone's throw from the home of English rugby, Twickenham Stadium. And of course, Twickenham is the suburb of London in which they are located. Wait, is it a suburb? Well, whatever you call them in England. I'd say that the Stoop is a fairly typical small English stadium if it weren't for that DHL stand over there on the east, which looks very dynamic. As well as that, the seats are done up in Harlequins colours, which makes for an interesting look considering how many colours they have. Like 5 or so. Welford Road, home of Leicester Tigers. This one is also a stone's throw from a larger stadium. This time it's the KP, home of Leicester City. It may be smaller, but Welford Road definitely has more character. Each stand reminds me of another stadium. The North stand reminds me of Ashton Gate. The West stand reminds me of Brentford's new stadium that you'll see soon. As for the other two, well, there are innumerable stadiums in England with similar stands. This one's one of my favourites, and the fans seem to agree. It had the highest average attendance in the 2019-20 season, at just shy of 20,000. The aforementioned Brentford Community Stadium, home of London Irish. Yes, it was primarily built for Brentford Football Club, who are now in the Premier League. They are certainly the secondary tenants. I say that because London Irish do have the lowest average attendance, but I'm sure they'll get an uptick this season. It's worth buying a ticket just to take a look at the stadium if anything. It's absolutely stunning. You see so many stadiums in England with a similar capacity that have a somewhat symmetrical look to them. They're not distinctive and easily forgettable. But this one is one of a kind. The uniquely shaped design is partially due to the site's unique location, with train tracks on each side. But still, even if it were in a field somewhere, the unusual design works for me. Kingston Park, home of Newcastle Falcons. It's another interesting design, this one. If you're approaching from the east, it would almost look like someone's house with the world's greatest backyard. Or back garden, I should say. But I do quite like that. The rest of the stadium looks like a stadium. As with many grounds in this competition, there are terraces behind each goal, one of which is uncovered. But they do plan on upgrading that stand to look more or less like the rest. And when I say the rest, I mean these two. I still can't get over how strange that looks. But don't get me wrong, it looks pretty cool and I hope it stays like that. Franklin's Gardens, home of Northampton Saints. It's overshadowed by what appears to be Northampton's tallest building, and that really is saying something. I hear Northampton is known as the Manhattan of Northamptonshire. It was actually built to test out lifts, or as they're known in America, elevators. In Australia we call them up and down rooms, and in New Zealand, well, they don't have them there yet. Nah, I'm sick of this. Always picking on the little guy. We launch rockets. Of course we have lifts. We're an advanced nation. Okay, we call them magic boxes. Alright, it was just a joke. And I'd just like to sneak in, we kick everybody's ass in rugby. Okay. The ground itself looks top notch, inside and out. There's an interesting situation with one stand that's a terrace lower down, and the rest is an all-seater. But I think there's always a demand for terracing in rugby stadiums. The rest of the ground is seated. Fucking kick your ass, bitch. AJ Bell Stadium, home of the Sale Sharks. It's also the home of the Salford Devils rugby league team, which is quite rare that the two codes share. This is one of the best looking stadiums so far. They've kept it somewhat traditional, while also going with a very modern aesthetic in some places. The facade of the main stand in particular looks fantastic. Despite this, the club had the second lowest average attendance in 2019-20, at around 6,500. But that's still more than the Salford Devils, so a win for rugby union, I guess. Oh, and it's located right by, not a river, but the Manchester Ship Canal. Just, not particularly relevant, just a little fun fact. StoneX Stadium, home of Saracens. Well, this one's a bit different. As you can see, it's the first and only stadium in this competition to have a running track around the field. But they've made the most of what they have by putting some movable stands on the track itself in order to create a more intimate atmosphere. It's strange, but it's more or less superficial. It doesn't really matter so much when you're sitting in the stands watching the game. It was also the first stadium in the league with an artificial turf pitch, so it's not one for the traditionalists, this one. But at least it does the job. If you're wondering why they don't just build permanent stands, well, that costs money. But also, there are a couple of athletics clubs that still use the track. And trust me, you don't want to mess with an athletics club. They can really make a murder look like a javelin accident. Coventry Building Society Arena, home of Wasps. A bit of a weird situation with this one. If you're not aware, it was built primarily for Coventry City Football Club, hence the colour of the seats. But then Wasps, being Wasps, just went along and bought the place, moved in and took over. But after some disputes, Coventry City are now back. To the stadium itself now, I would say is a fairly typical small English football stadium, kinda like the King Power we saw earlier, if it wasn't for its most unique feature, which isn't even in the stadium. It's the attached exhibition hall that you can see there. It's used for various things like conventions, netball, and that kind of stuff. But by far its most important use is as a prison, for when the Coventry City owners don't pay the rent. You might think it's overkill, and perhaps a human rights violation, but last time they got away. Six Ways Stadium, home of the Worcester Warriors. I presume it's called that because the architect thought of 6 different ways the stadium could look, and he couldn't decide on which, actually sexist, he or she couldn't decide on which one to go with. But that's quite alright. Character is better than uniformity in my view. And of course my theory regarding the naming isn't true. It's actually because of this thing. It goes off in 6 directions, I guess. The ground is dominated by the big modern East Stand, which you could say is double tiered. But not really, it just has a few rows of seating up top in front of the corporate suites. But it looks fantastic, as does the rest of the ground. A great stadium to end with. And that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, then please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, have a good one.